Imagine a world where the Bible as we know it didn't exist. Not just the King James Bible or even the Latin Vulgate, but the very first translation of the Old Testament into a language other than Hebrew. For centuries, scholars have pointed to a single moment in time, the creation of the Septuagint in the city of Alexandria. But what if that story isn't the whole story? What if a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures existed before the Septuagint, an older, forgotten text that generations of scholars have considered a myth? The clues are hidden in the works of ancient historians, buried in the fragments of forgotten accounts. To understand the mystery, we first need to understand what we know. For a long time, the academic consensus was simple. There are no documented Greek references to Hebrew scriptures before the Septuagint. The Septuagint itself, a translation of the Pentateuch, is believed to have been created in the late 270s BCE. Ancient writers like Hecataeus of Abdera and Manetho were certainly familiar with Jewish culture, and a man named Moses. Hecataeus knew of Moses as the great Jewish lawgiver, but here's the key point: he didn't know of the written Jewish laws. Their knowledge was based on oral traditions, not on a translated scroll. But what if three separate ancient accounts hinted at something different? These aren't mainstream historical records, but rather pseudepigraphical works, texts written under a false name, often with a specific agenda. We're talking about the fragments of Pseudo-Hecataeus, the writings of Aristobulus, and the famous Letter of Aristeas. All three traditions, dating from the 2nd or 1st century BCE, tell us the same tantalizing thing. A Greek translation of parts of the Pentateuch existed before the Septuagint, a scroll of Jewish law at the time of Hecataeus, references to the Exodus and conquest in a Greek translation before the Septuagint, and even the Letter of Aristeas mentions a defective Greek translation that predated the famous one. These accounts are late, which means they must be used with caution. But the simple fact that they exist at all forces us to ask an important question: where did these stories come from? Were they simply fiction, or did they contain a kernel of truth? Let's start with the most fascinating case, Pseudo-Hecataeus. This account, cited by the historian Josephus, tells a remarkable story about a Jewish high priest named Hezekiah. According to the text, Hezekiah traveled to Egypt during the time of Ptolemy I Soter. In Alexandria, he met with scholarly friends, including the real Hecataeus of Abdera. Here's the shocking part. Hezekiah supposedly read from his entire scroll of Jewish scriptures, a scroll that contained the history of their settlement and their political constitution. At first glance, this seems like irrefutable evidence, but as modern scholars have definitively shown, the text is a forgery. It contains anachronisms, references to events like the Battle of Gaza in 312 BCE, which happened after the real Hecataeus wrote his work. The purpose of this fabricated story becomes clear when we compare it to the genuine fragments of Hecataeus. The real Hecataeus, in an authentic fragment, tells us that a man named Moses led a colony and founded Jerusalem, establishing laws and political institutions. The key is that Hecataeus' story follows the classic Greek pattern of a foundation story, where colonization comes first, followed by the law. This is the reverse of the biblical Hexateuch. Now let's look at what Pseudo-Hecataeus claimed was in Hezekiah's scroll, the history of their settlement and their political constitution. Do you notice the phrasing? It's a direct summary of the real Hecataeus' work. The forger wasn't introducing new information, he was simply creating a fictional story to explain why the real Hecataeus knew about the Jews at all. The author of Pseudo-Hecataeus, living in the 2nd or 1st century BCE, was familiar with the Septuagint and its history. He saw that the real Hecataeus' account of the Jews resembled the Exodus story, and naturally assumed Hecataeus must have seen a translated version of the Pentateuch. The forgery was simply an attempt to provide a fictional historical framework for that assumption. This means that Pseudo-Hecataeus provides no independent evidence for a pre-Septuagint Greek translation. It's a dead end, an interesting historical red herring. So where does this leave us? We have three ancient accounts, all hinting at an older Greek translation, and yet no physical evidence. No fragment of a Greek or Hebrew predecessor to the Septuagint has ever been found. The existence of these older texts remain, at best, hypothetical.
We've seen that pseudo-Hecataeus is a forgery, designed to explain an existing fact, not to document a new one. But what about Aristobulus and the letter of Aristeas?
Aristobulus was a Jewish philosopher who lived around 150 BCE. He was a tutor to Ptolemy VI Philometor himself. His primary goal was to prove that the Jewish scriptures were not only authoritative, but also the foundation of Greek philosophy. To support this bold claim, Aristobulus began sifting through all of Greek literature for evidence. He argued that names like Homer, Hesiod, Pythagoras, Socrates, and Plato were all familiar with Jewish traditions. This in itself was a revolutionary claim. But how would it have been possible for Greek philosophers who lived centuries earlier to have had access to Jewish scriptures? Aristobulus offered an ingenious but controversial solution. He claimed that a Greek translation of Jewish law had existed long before the famous Septuagint. According to him, this translation was made even before Alexander the Great and the Persian conquests. This earlier text was not a complete translation of the Jewish Bible. Aristobulus described it as including parts relating to the exodus of the Jews, the conquest of the land, and a detailed description of the whole law. He acknowledged that the full translation of the law was only completed during the time of King Ptolemy II Philadelphus, which supported the traditional story of the Septuagint. In this way, Aristobulus proposed the existence of two translations, an early, incomplete translation and a complete one that we call the Septuagint. At first glance, Aristobulus's claim seems like convincing evidence, but when we look closer, a remarkable similarity emerges. Aristobulus's description of this early translation, the story of the Exodus, the conquest of the land, and the laws, perfectly matches Hecataeus of Abdera's account of the origins of the Jews. Hecataeus, a Greek historian who lived before Aristobulus, had mentioned that Moses led a colony out of Egypt and founded Jerusalem, where he established laws. And here is the most important detail. Both Hecataeus and Aristobulus describe the sequence of events in the same way. First the settlement of the land, then the creation of the laws. This is the reverse chronology of the biblical account, where Mosaic legislation precedes the conquest of the Promised Land by Joshua. This identical sequence of events is no coincidence. It is a characteristic feature of stereotypical Greek foundation stories, where a leader first establishes a colony and then introduces its constitution. This suggests that Aristobulus did not have access to a real earlier translation of the Jewish Bible. Instead, he used the account of Hecataeus. Aristobulus was searching through Greek literature for connections to Jewish law. When he came across Hecataeus's Aegyptiaca, he likely concluded that the mention of the colonization of Judea from Egypt was evidence that Hecataeus was familiar with the Exodus story. Aristobulus then inferred that for Hecataeus to be familiar with this story, it must have been translated into Greek during his time. Aristobulus's report of a Greek translation preceding the Septuagint is not based on authentic, direct knowledge of such a text. Instead, it is an inference drawn from the account of Hecataeus. Similar to pseudo-Hecataeus, whom we discussed in a previous episode, Aristobulus uses existing Greek sources to justify his thesis, rather than presenting new, verifiable facts. This means that Aristobulus can also be dismissed as a witness to the existence of Jewish scriptures translated into Greek before the Septuagint. Rather than giving us evidence of a missing Jewish Bible, he shows us how ancient authors used existing Greek traditions to construct their own history. So, having examined both Pseudo-Hecataeus and Aristobulus, we arrive at the same conclusion. While many authors have tried to connect Greek and Jewish cultures and to prove that the Greeks were familiar with Jewish scriptures, there is a lack of authentic evidence that this happened before the Septuagint. The first and most certain external evidence for the existence of the Pentateuch is the translation of the Septuagint. Due to the homogeneous style of the translation, scholars believe that the entire Pentateuch was translated into Greek simultaneously. Literary traditions agree that this occurred either during the time of Ptolemy I or during his successor, Ptolemy II Philadelphus. One of the earliest confirmations of the Septuagint's existence comes from Demetrius the chronographer, whose chronology of Genesis corresponds to that in the Septuagint, not the later Masoretic text.
Demetrius wrote during the time of Ptolemy IV Philopator, who ruled between 221 and 204 BCE. This gives us a clear terminus ad quem. The translation must have been completed before 204 BCE. For the date of the translation, our main source is Aristobulus, a Jewish philosopher from around 150 BCE. As a tutor to Ptolemy VI, Aristobulus had access to all the resources of the Library of Alexandria. He claimed that the Pentateuch was translated under the patronage of Ptolemy II Philadelphus. But where did he get this information? It's possible he read the library's catalog called the Pentateuch, compiled by Callimachus. This catalog likely contained a record of the Septuagint, which listed the authors, the 70 elders, and the royal patronage of Ptolemy II. Additionally, he may have drawn from oral traditions associated with an annual festival on the island of Pharos that celebrated the creation of the translation. These testimonies seem convincing, but we must be careful. Unfortunately, Aristobulus, like other ancient authors, was prone to error. He claimed that Demetrius of Phaleron directed the Septuagint translation project under the rule of Ptolemy II. But history tells us something completely different. Demetrius was an advisor to Ptolemy I, but fell out of favor when Ptolemy II came to power in 282 BCE. Within a year, Demetrius was exiled and died shortly thereafter. This historical fact excludes the possibility that Demetrius of Phaleron directed the translation under the patronage of Ptolemy II. This seriously undermines the credibility of the details presented by Aristobulus and other sources. So, is his entire story simply inaccurate? Another detail from the text, called the Letter of Aristeus, which scholars attribute to Aristobulus, claims that Queen Arsinoe II was alive when the translation was first presented. She was the sister and wife of Ptolemy II, and died in July 269 BCE. Although the Letter of Aristeus contains fictional details, the internal content of the Septuagint itself may support this claim. An important example is the use of the word hair. The Greek word for hair is logos. However, the Septuagint avoids this word and instead uses the more neutral term dazupos, hairy foot. Why? The Ptolemaic dynasty was known as the Logids, as Ptolemy I's father was named Logos. Avoiding the word logos was likely out of fear of offending the pharaohs. Furthermore, Queen Arsinoe II had a reputation for being sensitive. She married her brother, and the Greek poet Sotades was imprisoned for an indecent poem about the marriage. Since the hair was a symbol of sexual licentiousness in antiquity, the translators likely avoided the word so as not to offend the queen. This strongly supports the claim that the translation was made during Arsinoe II's reign. Despite Aristobulus's inaccuracies about Demetrius, the evidence regarding Arsinoe is much more convincing. With a high degree of certainty, we can date the translation of the Septuagint to the period between 273 and 269 BCE. This is the absolute deadline for the writing of the Pentateuch. There is no evidence for the existence of the Pentateuch before this date. But after this translation, there was an explosion of Jewish writings based on the Pentateuch. In the 3rd century BCE, texts like the Astronomical Book of Enoch, the Testament of Levi, and the Book of Jubilees appeared, which shows that the Septuagint became a catalyst for the development of Jewish literature. Up to this point, we have evidence only of an oral law passed down by priests, not a written code attributed to Moses. This analysis has huge consequences. It doesn't just clarify the date of an ancient translation, it pushes back the deadline for the writing of the Pentateuch by several centuries. This opens the door to new possibilities, for example, that the Pentateuch may have been influenced by Greek literary sources written after Hecataeus but before the Septuagint. The lack of evidence for a written law before 273 BCE, combined with the subsequent appearance of numerous texts based on the Septuagint, makes us wonder. Perhaps the history of the Bible is much more complex and intertwined with the fabric of the ancient world than we have imagined. Subscribe to our channel to continue to uncover these historical mysteries together.